Hi, everyone. Welcome to the lecture and discussion about truth, affordance, and the Hegelian dialectic. I don't know if you know who the German philosopher Hegel was, but he was best known for a concept called the Hegelian dialectic. And it became very popular in being put to use and is widely discussed concept in conspiracy circles. Um, and so we get to what he states here. And he says, the synthetic solution to the conflicts can't be introduced unless those manipulated take a side that will advance the predetermined agenda. Okay, and the key to what he was stating in this quote is that idea of predetermination or having a plan in mind. And this applies to those larger entities like certain groups or governments. And so we'll get more into the Hegelian dialectic, but first I want to kind of talk to you about the types of truths that can happen when making your argument. If I can advance the slides. Sorry, guys, I had it clicked on. So it brings us to what big T versus little t truths are, okay? Big T truths can't really be disputed. Those are universal truths that are widely accepted. They're factual, they're things that are observable and what happened in all actuality. For instance, most people know that the sun actually rises in the east and sets in the west. That's generally accepted knowledge. Some may try to argue this idea, but it's widely accepted through reasoning and scientific fact. Unless something should happen and the shift of the Earth's axis gets moved and, yada, yada. And so that would be a big T truth. It also applies to video camera footage or view. So much of this, like surveillance, is in our conversation, especially in our modern times. And so if you happen to capture, say, like a store captures like a robbery, for instance, if you saw that whole video from start to finish that was unaltered or not filtered in any way, or when you see it from start to finish, that would be considered a large T truth. You start to see little T truths when you only see that partial video or things out of context, right? So we only get that small part of the whole picture, and that little T shows a characterization of that potential the people involved in that scenario. So for instance, the video can be altered in a way that presents a person as guilty when they're actually not, if you find out by watching the whole video, and vice versa. Sometimes that it can be altered enough to where maybe the video shows an innocent party and perhaps they truly weren't. But again, it only shows that partial vantage or perception of the truth. And we arrive to opinions, judgments, and interpretations based off of just part of that information. So those little t truths occur, and if you reflect on them, they're actually considered lies or deception, right? Often little t truths are used in rhetoric just to persuade people and also cloud people's judgments and opinions. So really these little t truths are only true to the person that is employing or saying it, and it's also based on a belief system of opinions, interpretations, and assumptions. And this happens all the time in our day-to-day. You might not have the same belief as the person that's sitting next to you. You might not have the same experiences as they have. You might not have the same background or the upbringing. So it's very subjective, these little t truths. This happens often with subject matter like religion and politics, and especially in matters of preferences and our tastes. So, for example, it can be as minor or mundane as vanilla ice cream versus chocolate ice cream. You might be having a debate with your partner, and one may like one flavor or preference better than the other. And so, for instance, I might like chocolate ice cream better than vanilla ice cream, and my husband might like vanilla better. And so our truths about the matter are quite different based off our opinion and our interpretation and our judgments about the flavoring of ice cream. So we hold different little t truths. And so when comparing little t truths to the big T truths, we learn to state the unarguable truths, and we try to seek those big T truths by providing evidence and proving them as such, right? Which brings us to affordances and constraints. These help us to figure out what factors or potential factors and variables work on the types of truth, okay? And so we use these ideas to see how things operate and function. So for instance, we might have a bucket in the room, and this potentially affords us a range of possibilities, right? It affords us to be able to put water or other food items or something in to feed our pets. So it serves that function. It affords us to be able to pour the water into another container. Or we might think about expand those possibilities and think about the not so typical functions, like having the bucket flip over and using it for a seat, right? And so we think about those potentials or those possibilities. We also, when we take a look at that object and how it operates in our environment, we think about the constraints, and some are inherent to that object, but some can be created. For instance, you can put the bucket over your head and it can hide your face. So we have created that constraint, but because of the material that it's made of, it's probably not clear, because most buckets aren't. It inhibits you from seeing out into the environment, right? So that's something that the constraints are already present with that object and its function, right? So we create some of those constraints, but there are also some that are inherent. So when we think about affordances. Those are the range of possibilities with that object. And constraints are those limits to the alternatives or limits on the possibilities. So when we think about little t truths, those are those constraints that they limit our understanding of those big picture or larger t truths. Okay. Arguments, they can be muddled by both the big T and the little t truths. It's hard to kind of distinguish sometimes. That's done sometimes unintentionally, but sometimes very intentionally when people make their arguments. So we can be deceived by the little t truths that exist, and because sometimes they're embedded in between those larger truths. As I mentioned the other day to you all, I am a kind of an X-Files nerd, and we talked about the Smoky Man character, as you see in the picture here. He's also called Deep Throat. But this show, I encourage you guys to check it out, because the show talks about different conspiracy theories in every episode, and it's just an interesting show. But anyway, I digress. But back to the little t big tree, like we talked about with that quote, like the quote says, sometimes the best lie is hidden between two truths. Okay, so that things can be layered, whether they're intentional and not. When we read something and we hear something, and it can lend to people being all or nothing when they hear someone making arguments. And so we have to be very careful about falling into that pitfall of all or nothings. So when you start investigating and you look at the evidence, you want to start to evaluate, why is this true? Okay, so you start going along and seeing what people are arguing, and you say, well, this is true, and well, this supports it, and this is true. And then you look at some evidence and it doesn't quite add up, right? But you continue to read it, and you see that the arguments have improved, and this is true, and this seems to be true, but here's some areas that are not true. And you get done with the whole argument or paper, and you saw that most of it was true, and therefore you assume that overall it was all true, so this must be all true, right? So that's where that deception works. And so we have to be wary about how people can slip in those little t truths in between those big T truths. Okay. And so I kind of want to get back to that original slide about the Hegelian dialectic, where that plays a role with these truths. Okay. So conspiracies have us looking at the tensions between narratives. Okay. And so the Hegelian dialectic is that interpretive method originally used to relate specific entities or events to an absolute idea, in which some assertable propositions, a thesis, is necessarily opposed by an equally assertable and apparently contradictory proposition, the antithesis. The mutual contradiction being reconciled on a higher level of truth by the third proposition, synthesis. Okay, and so like a real world scenario, say you are thinking about going on a diet, you yourself, and so you're talking to your family members and say, I'm thinking about cutting out sugar from my diet because I want to get more healthy. And So you've presented that thesis, right, to your family. And the family member that you're talking to says, whoa, that's crazy talk. You don't need to cut it out. It isn't way too many foods and you'll just be miserable. So I don't think that's a great idea. And so your family member presents that antithesis or that contrary thought or argument, okay, into this conversation. And so you have both of these arguments and you want to arrive to a higher truth or reconciling this with a solution. And so you come to arrive to, and in considering both of those state arguments, you arrive to this solution that says, well, I can just reduce the intake of my sugar to improve my health, right? And so you took both arguments and you synthesized or brought together the two arguments and had that arrive to a deeper truth or understanding. You actually change your behavior slightly and slowly, and you still eat the things that you enjoy, but you act in a more healthy and methodical way with the way that you intake sugar, okay? And so you've effectively changed that pattern. And so Hegel says, once you start to apply the dialectical pattern to and start to see that, you can apply it to everything else. So you can begin to move slowly towards an absolute or a transformation and begin that process again, okay? And this is a perpetual process of starting and refining and moving to a more perfect or transformational state. So it's something that's constantly in movement or motion. And some people would say towards that singularity or that perpetuation towards that perfection. In conspiracy theories, in circles, they call it the problem, action, and solution, the Hegelian dialectic or that pattern, okay? And so this, when it's talked about in conspiracy theory circles, it's the dialectic is looked at in a very reductive way. The Hegelian dialectic, this is primarily discussed when it comes to social engineering, in that the government or some organization wants to guide a population towards a specific action or behavior. So they will use the Hegelian dialectic of problem, reaction, solution. Hegel realizes that this pattern occurs naturally in social interaction and behavior to resolve problems. But he also realized you can set up the whole framework to put the thing in motion for a specific outcome, okay? So we have that visual that we had talked about the other day, the Boston Massacre. And we'll get to that in a second. So, sorry guys. So when you are using that pattern in the dialectic, you have actors in authority that direct the whole little t truth, okay? They start with that little t truth, okay? And then they employ bad actors to initiate a type of reaction to create chaos and confusion. So they, so that a population feels that chaos and confusion and are seeking for guidance or a relief from that initial situation. All right. Then you have the authority who has a pre-planned solution, and they provide that solution, and society is moved into a desired direction, the way they want them to move. And so again, we have that Boston Massacre. So you have the forefathers, which are that authority that wants to direct a truth, the little t truth. Okay, so they want to be free from the British crown, and they're looking for the population to be on board with that. But people were dragging their feet. They were reluctant to join the war effort. And so they needed people to move to the idea of ceding from the British crown. Okay, and you'll hear conspiracy theorists say, oftentimes, never let a good tragedy or crisis go to waste. Okay, and so the authorities knew that the redcoats were going to be in Boston. They also knew that the American people, some groups, were planning a peaceful protest, and so they employed some bad actors to go there and chide the redcoats and stir up sentiment with the American protesters. So they had agents on both sides trying to stir up that chaos. Okay, and you heard the shot around the world, and they got the reaction. So there was violence and bloodshed, and so the forefathers stated that problem, and then got the reaction, and they were like, see what these evil redcoats did? They harmed these innocent people. How dare they? We must move away from that evil government, that crown that would put such harm and violence onto our citizens. And so they introduced the document that was pre-packaged, the Declaration of Independence, that had been worked on for many years. And they went back to the drawing board and added some revisions to it. But all in all, they had the solution prepared, and most of the people were on board with it after that incident. So that is how that problem reaction solution worked. And if you investigate that incident, you'll find that not very many, there were 8 people that were prosecuted, and not very severely. So in any case, it's interesting to see that mechanism work. With this last slide, you can see that this is a model to help you visualize and see potentially that 9/11 scenario, since that's what we've been talking about with the film and with your reading for this week. So again, you see the agenda, which is that centralized power and wanting to move a government more towards an oligarchy or a fascist state. And so, and with more centralized control for the government. Okay, so that's the motivation or the action that they want to have happen. And so you go through that dialectic where you have the thesis. Okay, there was the arrangement for the terrorists and for them, whether you hear conversations that surround terrorism and terrorists, and even if they're real weapons of mass destruction, all of that, you get bombarded with that narrative of terror, and terrorist organizations and what have you. And so you have that revolving first narrative. And then you have the antithesis, where there were potentially bad actors, where planes had gone into the building, and then you see the whole collapse, and there was that incident and that trauma, that fight and flight response that people saw. It was very, very dramatic. And so the authorities in our government were very quick afterwards to say, see, look what happened with these evil terrorists. And then they move quickly to that synthesis and say that they have that prepackaged 1,000-page document of the Patriot Act. And you see that increase in the Department of Defense budget and that surveillance, right? And so you see that that the removal of freedoms and the transfer of power to that centralized government, however small, began to start happening, okay? And so you can see how conspiracy theorists have adopted this pattern for which these two contradictory narratives can come together in a synthesis and move people to that action or transformation, okay? So I hope that you enjoyed this short and brief conversation about truth and the dialectic. I look forward to talking to you more, and I hope that you guys have a good week.